on her round, chubby, sunburned cheeks. It may seem strange that with her great popularity and her well-known maternal instincts she had not been kept fully supplied with proper and more conventional dolls, but it was soon recognized that she did not care for them, left their waxen faces, rolling eyes, and abundant hair in ditches, or stripped them to help clothe the more extravagant creatures of her fancy. So it came that Johnny Dear's strictly classical profile looked out from under a girl's fashionable straw sailor hat to the utter obliteration of his prominent intellectual faculties. The Amplach twins wore bonnets on their 9-pin heads, and even an attempt was made to fit a flaxen scalp on the iron-headed Misery. But her dolls were always a creation of her own, her affection for them increasing with the demand upon her imagination. This may seem somewhat inconsistent with her habit of occasionally abandoning them in the woods or in the ditches, but she had an unbounded confidence in the kindly maternity of nature, and trusted her children to the breast of the Great Mother as freely as she did herself in her own motherlessness. And this confidence was rarely betrayed. Rats, mice, snails, wildcats, panther, and bear never touched her lost waifs. Even the elements were kindly. An Amplach twin buried under a snowdrift in high altitudes reappeared smilingly in the spring in all its wooden and painted integrity. We were all pantheists then, and believed this implicitly. It was only when exposed to the milder forces of civilization that Mary had anything to fear. Yet even then, when Patsy O'Connor's domestic goat had once tried to sample the lost Misery, he had retreated with the loss of 3 front teeth, and Thompson's mule came out of an encounter with that iron-headed prodigy with a sprained hind leg and a cut and swollen pastern. But these were the simple Arcadian days of the road between Big Bend and Reno, and progress and prosperity, alas, brought changes in their wake. It was already whispered that Mary ought to be going to school, and Mr. Amplach, still happily oblivious of the liberties taken with his name, as trustee of the public school at Duckville, had intimated that Mary's bohemian wanderings were a scandal to the county. She was growing up in ignorance, a dreadful ignorance of everything but the chivalry, the deep tenderness, the delicacy and unselfishness of the rude men around her, and obliviousness of faith in anything but the immeasurable bounty of nature toward her and her children. Of course there was a fierce discussion between the "boys" of the road and the few married families of the settlement on this point, but, of course, progress and "snivelization," as the boys chose to call it, triumphed. The projection of a railroad settled it. Robert Fulks, promoted to a foremanship of a division of the line, was made to understand that his daughter must be educated, but the terrible question of Mary's family remained. No school would open its doors to that heterogeneous collection, and Mary's little heart would have broken over the rude dispersal or heroic burning of her children. The ingenuity of Jack Roper suggested a compromise. She was allowed to select one to take to school with her. The others were adopted by certain of her friends, and she was to be permitted to visit them every Saturday afternoon. The selection was a cruel trial, so cruel that, knowing her undoubted preference for her firstborn, Misery, we would not have interfered for worlds. But in her unexpected choice of Johnny Dear, the most unworldly of us knew that it was the first glimmering of feminine tact, her first submission to the world of propriety that she was now entering. Johnny Dear was undoubtedly the most presentable. Even more, there was an educational suggestion in its prominent, mapped-out phrenological organs. The adopted fathers were loyal to their trust. Indeed, for years afterward the blacksmith kept the iron-headed Misery on a rude shelf, like a shrine, near his bunk. Nobody but himself and Mary ever knew the secret, stolen, and thrilling interviews that took place during the first days of their separation. Certain facts, however, transpired concerning Mary's equal faithfulness to another of her children. It is said that one Saturday afternoon, when the road manager of the new line was seated in his office at Reno in a private business discussion with 2 directors, a gentle tap was heard at the door. It was opened to an eager little face, a pair of blue eyes, and a blue pinafore. To the astonishment of the directors, a change came over the face of the manager. Taking the child gently by the hand, he walked to his desk, on which the papers of the new line were scattered, and drew open a drawer from which he took a large 9-pin extraordinarily dressed as a doll. The astonishment of the two gentlemen was increased at the following quaint colloquy between the manager and the child. "She's doing remarkably well in spite of the trying weather, but I have had to keep her very quiet," said the manager, regarding the 9-pin critically. "Yes," said Mary quickly. "It's just the same with Johnny dear. His cough is frightful at nights. But Misery's all right. I've just been to see her." "There's a good deal of scarlet fever around," continued the manager with quiet concern, "and we can't be too careful. But I shall take her for a little run down the line tomorrow." The eyes of Mary sparkled and overflowed like blue water. Then there was a kiss, a little laugh, a shy glance at the two curious strangers, the blue pinafore fluttered away, and the colloquy ended. She was equally attentive in her care of the others, but the rag baby Gloriana, who had found a home in Jim Carter's cabin at the Ridge, living too far for daily visits, was brought down regularly on Saturday afternoon to Mary's house by Jim, tucked in asleep in his saddlebags or riding gallantly before him on the horn of his saddle. On Sunday there was a dress parade of all the dolls, which kept Mary in heart for the next week's desolation. But there came one Saturday and Sunday when Mary did not appear, and it was known along the road that she had been called to San Francisco to meet an aunt who had just arrived from "the States." It was a vacant Sunday to the boys, a very hollow, unsanctified Sunday, somehow, without that little figure. But the next Sunday, and the next, were still worse, and then it was known that the dreadful aunt was making much of Mary, and was sending her to a grand school, a convent at Santa Clara, where it was rumored girls were turned out so accomplished that their own parents did not know them. But we knew that was impossible to our Mary, and a letter which came from her at the end of the month, and before the convent had closed upon the blue pinafore, satisfied us, and was balm to our anxious hearts. It was characteristic of Mary, it was addressed to nobody in particular, and would, but for the prudence of the aunt, have been entrusted to the post office open and undirected. It was a single sheet, handed to us without a word by her father, but as we passed it from hand to hand, we understood it as if we had heard our lost playfellow's voice. "There's more houses in Frisco than you can shake a stick at, and women's till you can't rest, but mules and jackasses ain't got no shoe, nor blacksmiths' shops, which is not to be seen nowhere. Rabbits and squirrels, also bears and panthers, is unknown and unforgotten on account of the streets and Sunday skulls. Jim Roper, you oughter be very good to Misery on account of my not bein' here, and not hearten your heart to her because she is top heavy, which is ontrue and simply an imptient lie, like you allus make. I have a canary bird, what sings delightful, but isn't a yellowhammer such as I know, as you'd think. Dear Mr. Montgomery, don't keep Goolin Amplak too much shet up in office drawers. It isn't good for his lungs and chest. And don't you ink his head, nother. You're as bad as the rest. Johnny dear, you must be very kind to your adopted father, and you, Gloriana, must love your kind Jimmy Carter very much for taking you horseback so often. I has been buggy ridin' with an orficer who has killed Injuns real. I am comin' back soon with great affection, so look out and mind." But it was 3 years before she returned, and this was her last and only letter. The adopted fathers of her children were faithful, however, and when the new line was opened, and it was understood that she was to be present with her father at the ceremony, they came, with a common understanding, to the station to meet their old playmate. They were ranged along the platform, poor Jack Roper a little overweighted with a bundle he was carrying on his left arm, and then a young girl in the freshness of her teens and the spotless purity of a muslin frock that, although brief in skirt, was perfect in fit, faultlessly booted and gloved, tripped from the train, and offered a delicate hand in turn to each of her old friends. Nothing could be prettier than the smile on the cheeks that were no longer sunburnt. Nothing could be clearer than the blue eyes lifted frankly to theirs, and yet, as she gracefully turned away with her father, the faces of the 4 adopted parents were found to be as red and embarrassed as her own on that day that Yuba Bill drove up publicly with Johnny dear on the box seat. "You weren't such a fool," said Jack Montgomery to Roper, "as to bring Misery here with you. "I was," said Roper, with a constrained laugh.